It is said that some names should be left to die in the dust, spoken only in whispers and prayers for forgiveness. But the name Bloodworth refuses to fade. Like a stain on the fabric of history, it bleeds through every attempt to scrub it away. You will not find it in most official archives. It does not appear in the tidy genealogies of respectable families, but in the yellowing margins of court ledgers, in the brittle columns of forgotten newspapers, in the cramped ink of private journals. Locked away for centuries, the name waits, and with it, the horrors it carried into the world. The year was 1792, and the American frontier was a restless, dangerous place. The revolution had ended barely a decade earlier, but the promised peace was thin. Settlements in the northeast were pushing deeper into forested wilderness, clearing land that had been untouched for centuries. In the small township of Ashford Hollow, New York, the air carried the damp smell of pine and river mud. The winters were long and black, the kind where the wind howled through the cracks in the walls like an animal begging to be let in. The people here were devout, bound together by church and community, wary of strangers. And with good reason. That winter, the Bloodworth family arrived. They came in 2 covered wagons from the south, their belongings piled high, their children silent. Locals recalled the father, first Jonas Bloodworth, a tall man with broad shoulders and a gaunt face, his eyes so pale they seemed almost blind. His wife, Margaret, kept her head low beneath her bonnet, her skin unnaturally white, as if she'd been kept out of the sun for years. With them were their 3 sons, all in their late teens, and a young girl no one could place as either daughter or servant. They spoke little, their voices soft, clipped, and strange. The Bloodworths purchased a neglected estate on the edge of town, a crumbling colonial manor abandoned since the war. Locals avoided it. It had belonged to a loyalist officer who vanished without trace during the revolution. The land itself was overgrown and damp, and there were rumors of unmarked graves behind the property. Yet within weeks of moving in, the Bloodworths began restoring the house. Smoke rose from the chimneys day and night. Light glowed from the upper windows even into the early hours, as if no one inside ever slept. At first, the townspeople were polite. They offered bread, tools, and help with repairs, but the Bloodworths kept to themselves, rarely venturing into the village except for supplies. When Jonas did come, he paid in gold coins no one recognized, stamped with symbols no one could place. When asked about their past, he would smile faintly and say, "We are from older places than this land." The first unease came in spring. Children playing near the Bloodworth property claimed they heard chanting in the woods, low, rhythmic voices, joined by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. One boy swore he saw a circle of lanterns deep in the trees, with figures moving between them, their faces covered by masks. The boy's parents dismissed it as a wild tale, but they kept him indoors after dark. Not long after, the Reverend Thomas Bell of Ashford Hollow's church noted strange new faces in his congregation. These newcomers did not speak with the other villagers. They sat together in the last pew, never singing, never bowing their heads. The Reverend later wrote in his journal an entry dated April 14th, 1793, that the family Bloodworth seemed to draw souls unto themselves, and I cannot say how. Those who fall in with them do not return to me. It was not long before rumors turned to fear. 2 farmhands disappeared within a week of one another, both last seen near the Bloodworth estate. A traveling peddler claimed he was offered a place at the table by Jonas Bloodworth in exchange for selling him certain rare items. When asked what these items were, the peddler only muttered, "Bones, not from any animal I've seen," before refusing to speak further. By summer, the town had stopped calling on them entirely. Doors were locked earlier. The forest path that led to their estate grew over with weeds. And still, every night, lights burned in the upper windows of the manor, flickering like candles caught in a breath of wind. If this story were simply about an eccentric family living on the fringes of society, it might have ended there. But the Bloodworths were not merely odd. Their name would soon be tied to disappearances, whispered pacts, and a kind of hunger that could not be sated by food or fortune. And in the years to come, Ashford Hollow would learn that the Bloodworths had not come to hide from the world. They had come to feed on it. There is no surviving birth record for Jonas Bloodworth. No church registry bears his name before the year 1792. But in the archives of a burned courthouse in Virginia, there exists a water-damaged document, partially legible, dated 1769. It records the dissolution of a plantation estate following a fire that claimed the lives of the household of one Jonas B.N. The ink is smudged where the clerk's signature should be. Whether this refers to the same man who came to Ashford Hollow more than 2 decades later is uncertain. But in the margins, in a different hand, someone had scrawled the words, "He walks again." The Bloodworth family's origins were as elusive as mist. When asked about their past, Jonas and Margaret gave contradictory answers, sometimes claiming they had lived in the Carolinas, other times speaking of an old house across the sea. A few townsfolk noticed that their speech carried an older, almost archaic cadence, as though their words belonged to another century. The young girl with them dark-haired, sharp-eyed was called Elspeth. Whether she was daughter, niece, or ward, no one could tell. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in a language none of the villagers recognized. Through the spring and summer of 1793, the Bloodworth estate became a place of quiet but steady traffic. Strangers came at odd hours, well-dressed men and women, sometimes traveling alone, sometimes in pairs. They carried trunks and heavy satchels, staying only a night or two before departing again. None lodged at the village inn. Instead, they passed directly through the forest path to the Bloodworth property. The sound of horses could be heard in the dead of night, hooves muffled by damp earth. In July, a man named Samuel Klein, a cooper from Albany, came to Ashford Hollow to visit his sister. On his 3rd night in town, after drinking too much cider at the tavern, he claimed he had followed a lantern light into the woods out of idle curiosity. The light led him to the Bloodworth property. Through the trees, he said, he saw figures gathered around a low stone altar behind the manor. They were dressed in black robes, faces hidden by white masks shaped like elongated skulls. The figures were chanting, the words too strange to understand. In the center, lying on the stone, was something covered by a pale cloth. When the wind shifted, Klein swore he saw a human hand, small, childlike, slide out from beneath it. He fled without looking back. He told this story the next day, laughing it off as some strange country ritual, but the laughter rang hollow, and when pressed, he admitted the detail about the child's hand. The tavern fell silent. No one contradicted him. No one went to the authorities. Ashford Hollow, like so many towns at the time, kept its dangers close and unspoken. By autumn, Reverend Bell began receiving anonymous notes slipped under the church door. Some were written in shaky, uneven hands, others in precise, almost calligraphic script. All carried the same message in different words. They have taken another. One note, signed only with the initials MKH, described the smell of iron and smoke drifting from the Bloodworth estate on the night a boy named Andrew Locke vanished. Andrew's parents, too poor to travel far, had searched the surrounding woods for days, finding only a torn scrap of his wool coat snagged on a branch. The Reverend's journal from October 1793 holds the most detailed account. In it, he describes an unexpected visit from Margaret Bloodworth. She came alone, her bonnet tied tight under her chin, her gloves spotless despite the muddy road. She told him, in a voice so calm it unsettled him, that the boy is with us now, and you need not trouble your prayers for him. He is beyond their reach. When the Reverend demanded an explanation, Margaret only smiled faintly and said, "The world feeds on the young, Reverend. We are merely honest about our hunger." After that, the Reverend claimed, he began waking in the night to the sound of footsteps outside his window, though no one was ever there when he looked. His sermons grew darker, urging his congregation to root out the shadow in our midst, but his words had little effect by then. Several townsfolk had already fallen under the Bloodworth's influence. Some began adopting their strange mannerisms, speaking less, withdrawing from neighbors, and disappearing into the woods at night. What the Bloodworths believed or pretended to believe remains one of the great unanswered questions. Theories range from occult worship to some twisted form of medicine. In one 1824 account by a traveling physician named Dr. Ezra Pike, there is mention of a northern cult whose elders claimed they could draw vitality from human blood, extending their lives far beyond the natural span. Pike describes meeting a man whose hair was black as coal though his years exceeded 70, and a woman whose skin retained the bloom of youth though her eyes were older than time. Whether he spoke of the Bloodworths directly or some related order is unknown, but the echoes are hard to ignore. What is known is that Jonas Bloodworth began hosting gatherings inside the manor that lasted until dawn. The windows were shrouded, the doors locked, faint music low. Slow strings would carry on the wind, accompanied by voices chanting in unison. Villagers who lived nearest swore that on such nights, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. No dogs barked, no owls called. The very air seemed to thicken. One night in November, a farmer named Elias Trumbull saw something he refused to describe in detail until years later. When age had loosened his tongue, he had been sent to retrieve a wayward calf that had wandered near the Bloodworth property. Through the trees, he caught sight of the upper floor of the manor, every window aglow. In one, framed against the glass, was the figure of Jonas Bloodworth, holding a silver goblet. He raised it high, and as Elias watched, a crimson stream poured into it from above. The source was hidden, but the thick, dark movement of the liquid left little to the imagination. By winter, Ashford Hollow was divided. Some whispered about confronting the family. Others urged silence, fearing what might happen if they acted. And then came the first snow, and with it, the disappearance of Eliza Morton, the miller's daughter. She had last been seen walking toward the Bloodworth property at dusk, a basket of bread in her arms. She was never found. In the days that followed, Jonas Bloodworth was seen in town more often. His pale eyes seemed almost to shine in the low winter light. He spoke to shopkeepers with an unfamiliar warmth, even offering coins from his strange gold supply to help the church roof. The Reverend refused the gift, but others accepted, and slowly, the fear of the Bloodworths began to warp into something worse: compliance. The winter of 1793 into 1794 would later be called the White Silence. It was the season when Ashford Hollow learned that not all evils hide in the shadows. Some stand in the open, smiling, as they take what they want. By January of 1794, Ashford Hollow was no longer a town merely unsettled by the Bloodworths. It was a place that breathed with their presence. Those who spoke against them too loudly seemed to vanish from public life, sometimes leaving behind little more than a hastily scrawled note claiming they had gone west or taken ill and departed for family care. Others didn't leave any message at all. The snow seemed to swallow tracks. The trees seemed to lean a little closer to the road, and the nights felt longer than they had any right to be. It was during this winter that the first official document mentioning the Bloodworths appeared, though it would not be official for long. The record comes from the brief tenure of Constable Abraham Keller, a man new to the area, transferred from Dutchess County after a violent dispute with a landowner. Keller had no history with Ashford Hollow, and more importantly, no instinct for its quiet, unspoken agreements. In a surviving letter to his brother, dated February 3, 1794, Keller wrote, "The family called Bloodworth holds this town in a kind of unholy grip. The Reverend warns against them, yet half the church now walks in their company. I have seen their house from the road by moonlight. There is movement in the upper rooms, shapes in the windows, though no candles are lit. I believe they are keeping others there, and I mean to find out who." That was the last letter Keller ever sent. 2 weeks later, his horse was found riderless near the riverbank, its saddle torn and spattered with what appeared to be dried blood. Search parties combed the woods for 3 days, finding only one item: Keller's hat wedged high in the fork of a dead tree, too far up for any ordinary fall to have placed it there. His body was never recovered. The incident rattled the town, but did not break its strange silence. Fear had by now deepened into something colder: resignation. The Bloodworths still kept their distance from most villagers, but they no longer seemed to fear open suspicion. Jonas was seen riding into town with one of his sons, stopping at the blacksmith to commission an iron-bound chest. Margaret appeared at the mill, inquiring about grain in quantities far beyond what a single household could consume. When asked about the surplus, she replied, "There are always more mouths at our table than you can see." It was around this time that the Albany Gazette published a peculiar notice, a single paragraph buried on the 3rd page of the March 1, 1794 edition. "To those who inquire after the missing children in the northern settlements, be advised that certain parties in Ashford Hollow have taken it upon themselves to provide sanctuary and spiritual restoration for those deemed lost to wickedness. Such efforts ought not be impeded." The Gazette offered no source for the statement, nor any explanation for who had submitted it. The Reverend Bell was convinced it was connected to the Bloodworths, but his letters to the Albany authorities went unanswered. Then came the testimony of Jeremiah Hatch, a farmhand from the neighbouring town of Fox Hollow. He appeared in Ashford Hollow one rainy evening in April, soaked to the bone, demanding to speak to the Reverend. Hatch claimed he had been hired months earlier by Jonas Bloodworth himself, promised good wages for night work on the estate. At first, he had been tasked with hauling supplies: wood, barrels, sacks of grain. But one night, Jonas had called him to assist with something more delicate. Hatch described being led into a cellar beneath the manor, lit only by a ring. of candles placed along the stone walls. In the center was a pit, lined with bricks and covered by a heavy wooden lid. When Jonas opened it, the smell struck him first, a stench of rot, iron, and something sweet. Inside, Hatch claimed, were bodies, some fresh, others little more than bones. But what froze his blood, he said, was the fact that several of the bodies were wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending where they shouldn't, faces stretched as if molded by unseen hands. He had fled that night, abandoning his wages, and had hidden in the woods until he found the courage to leave. But as he spoke to the Reverend, his eyes darted to the church windows. Certain that they were watching, the Reverend urged Hatch to speak to the sheriff in Albany, but the young man refused, saying he would be gone before the week's end. He never made it out of Ashford Hollow. The last sighting of Jeremiah Hatch was 2 days later, near the edge of the Bloodworth property, speaking to Elspeth, the dark-eyed girl. Witnesses said she placed something small into his hand before leading him into the trees. He did not come back. By early summer of 1794, the disappearances could no longer be ignored. Pressure from neighbouring towns forced the Albany sheriff to send an investigator, Deputy Caleb Morin, to Ashford Hollow. Morin was pragmatic, skeptical, and, as he described himself, not the sort to be scared of by old wives' tales. He arrived on July 9th and began questioning locals. Many claimed ignorance. Some insisted the missing had simply left for better work or safer towns. Only Reverend Bell and a handful of others told Morin of the Bloodworth's strange influence. Morin decided to pay the family a visit. His written account, preserved in an 1811 collection of frontier tales compiled by historian Elias Ransom, gives the only first-hand description of the manor's interior. The house was sound in its bones, though the air within was heavy and close. The floors were covered in rugs of a foreign weave, and the walls bore portraits of stern men and women whose eyes seemed to follow the viewer. I was greeted by Jonas Bloodworth himself, who received me cordially but with an undercurrent of amusement, as though I was some actor playing my part in a story he already knew the ending to. I inquired after the missing persons, to which he replied, "Men go missing every day, Deputy. It is the way of a country still carving itself from wilderness." When I pressed further, his sons appeared silent, tall and pale as milk, and took up positions near the door. I left soon after, though not without noting that every door I passed in the house was locked from the outside. Morin did not have the authority to search the premises without a warrant, and by the time he returned to Albany to request one, political pressure had shifted. The matter was quietly dropped. That summer passed in a strange, oppressive calm. No new disappearances were reported, but the Bloodworth gatherings continued. On certain nights, smoke of an unusual colour bluish-green rose from the manor's chimneys. Those who saw it said the air carried a taste of copper, and that sleep was impossible on such nights. Dreams boiling into fevered visions. It would be more than a year before the next public horror emerged. But when it did, it would not be a whispered rumour or a buried court record. It would be something no one in Ashford Hollow could deny. The morning of October 14, 1795, began like any other in Ashford Hollow. Grey skies pressing low over the valley, the smell of damp leaves clinging to the air. But by dusk, the town would be changed forever. It started with a sound, faint at first, then growing louder, the ringing of the church bell. Not the slow, measured toll for a death, nor the cheerful peal for a wedding, but a frenzied, uneven clang, as if struck by an unsteady hand. It was Reverend Bell who rang it, his white hair wild, his voice hoarse from shouting. To the manor, he cried to the gathering villagers, "God help us all, bring your courage, bring your fire." His words were disjointed, his eyes burning with something between terror and conviction. When pressed, he pointed toward the hill where the Bloodworth estate loomed, its windows aglow with a sickly, pulsating light. By the time, a crowd had formed 50 strong, armed with lanterns, pitchforks, muskets. Bell's story was spilling from his lips in fevered fragments. He claimed he had been walking the road near the manor when he heard chanting, low and rhythmic, not in English, but in some guttural, ancient tongue. Drawn closer, he saw through a side window the flicker of dozens of candles in a great hall stripped bare of furniture. The Bloodworths, he said, stood in a circle around a figure laid out upon a black cloth. He swore it was a young man from Fox Hollow who had gone missing that summer. His chest rose and fell shallowly, as if caught in some half-sleep. Above him, Jonas Bloodworth held a curved knife that glinted in the candlelight, The Reverend had run for the bell before he saw more. The mob, though no one dared call it, that moved up the slope in a slow, shivering wave. The closer they came to the manor, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though the night itself resisted their intrusion. Some swore they heard whispers under the wind, their own names drawn out in sibilant syllables. Others said their lantern. Flames quivered in time with the chanting inside. They reached the great double doors and found them unbarred, swinging open with a groan. What met them inside was worse than any rumor. The hall was just as Bell described, empty of its usual finery, save for a ring of black candles whose flames burned unnaturally tall and blue. In the center lay the young man, eyes closed, skin pale as bone. He was breathing, but each exhale came with a faint, rattling sigh. Surrounding him were Jonas, Margaret, their 3 sons, and Elspeth. All were clad in robes of deep crimson, the fabric embroidered with patterns that seemed to twist in the candlelight. Their eyes, every one of them, were fixed on the intruders. Unblinking, Jonas spoke first, his voice calm and warm, as if greeting neighbors at his table. "You should not have come. This is not for your eyes," one of the villagers, a blacksmith named Harlan Pike, stepped forward with his musket raised. "Let him go, now." Jonas tilted his head, almost pitying. "He is already where you cannot follow." It was then that Margaret lifted her hands, palms outstretched, and began to chant louder. The language was thick with consonants, rolling in a cadence that seemed to pull at the listeners' chests. Several villagers stumbled back, clutching at their ribs, as though their very hearts were being coaxed toward her voice. Shot rang out the blacksmith's musket, but when the smoke cleared, Jonas still stood, the ball lodged in the wood of the wall behind him. He did not flinch. Instead, he drew the curved knife upward, and without breaking eye contact slashed the air above the young man's body. The cut did not touch flesh, but the boy's back arched violently, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Panic broke the standoff. Several men surged forward, tackling Jonas and his sons. Margaret shrieked not in fear, but in fury before being wrestled to the ground by 3 women from the crowd. Elspeth slipped away into the shadows. To this day, no one can say for certain how she escaped, but she was gone when they searched the upper floors. In the chaos, someone kicked over a candle, and its strange blue flame caught instantly on the black cloth. The fire spread unnaturally fast, racing in tendrils across the floor as if seeking the walls. The villagers dragged the unconscious young man from the circle, his chest still rising shallowly. Others began pulling the Bloodworths toward the door, even as they thrashed and hissed like cornered animals. Outside, the autumn wind fed the flames. By the time the last person fled the manor, the fire had devoured half the structure. But even as the roof collapsed inward, witnesses swore they heard chanting from within, not screams, but a steady, unbroken rhythm. And in the highest window, where the light burned brightest, some claimed they saw a tall, thin figure with eyes like coals, watching them leave when dawn came. The manor was nothing but a blackened skeleton. And yet, amidst the smouldering ruin, the bodies of Jonas, Margaret, and their sons were not found. The young man from Fox Hollow was taken to the church infirmary, but he never awoke. He lingered for 3 days before passing, his face fixed in a strange, almost serene expression. The authorities from Albany finally arrived 2 days later, too late to catch the Bloodworths and too unwilling to chase phantoms into the wild country. They took statements, recorded names, and left with the official conclusion that the family had perished in the fire, despite the fact that not a single charred bone was recovered. But in Ashford Hollow, no one believed they had died that night. The town lay under a suffocating stillness. No crickets, no wind, just the creak of timbers calling in the ruins on the hill. And for those unlucky enough to live nearby, the faint sound of a woman singing somewhere in the trees. The first true investigation into the Bloodworth affair began not in Ashford Hollow, but in Albany, at the office of Magistrate Silas Thorne. It was January of 1796, nearly 3 months after the fire. By then, the winter had sealed the town under snow, and many in the capital assumed the rumors of cult activity were little more than frontier superstition. But Thorne was not so sure. He had received by post a thick packet of sworn statements from Reverend Bell's statements, accompanied by a parcel of objects retrieved from the ruins, a bent brass key, 3 unbroken black candles, and a fragment of scorched parchment bearing symbols that no one could translate. Thorne began quietly summoning witnesses to Albany. Some came willingly, desperate to unburden themselves. Others had to be compelled. Over the course of 6 weeks, the magistrate assembled what he called the record of Bloodworth, the strange hybrid of court transcript, travel journal, and personal speculation. In it, we find the testimony of Harlan Pike, the blacksmith who fired the musket that night. His voice is preserved on the page in shaky, uncertain handwriting. When the shot did not take him, I knew it was no natural man before me. His eyes did not blink, his breath did not quicken. He looked at me as if at some small insect beneath his shoe, and I confess to you I feared I was damned already, only for having seen him so. Then there is the statement of Abigail Crow, a midwife who helped subdue Margaret. Her skin was cold, not as in sickness, but like stone in winter. When we had her to the ground, she spoke words I could not understand. The sound made my teeth ache. She told me my firstborn was not my own, but had been marked by the river. I had not told a soul that my son was born with the call. More chilling still was the deposition of Josiah Finch, a boy of 17 at the time. I saw them in the woods before the fire 2 nights before, the mother and the daughter, walking hand in hand. They passed within 10 feet of me. They did not touch the snow. The ground beneath them stayed dark. The magistrate, in his own notes, writes of a troubling encounter during his review of these testimonies. One evening, while working late, he heard what he believed to be a knock at his chamber door. Yet when he opened it, he found only the brass key from the Bloodworth ruins lying in the hall, though it had been sealed in his desk. By March, Thorne was convinced the Bloodworth family had not perished in the fire. He petitioned for a broader search of the surrounding counties. In April, 2 trappers reported seeing figures moving along the tree line near the Hudson River, a tall man and a smaller woman, their clothing red as fox fur. The trappers swore the pair vanished into the fog as they approached. It was also in April that a farmer in Fox Hollow turned over a strange discovery to the Albany authorities. A leather-bound ledger, water-damaged and warped, found wedged between stones in an abandoned well. The handwriting matched letters known to be Jonas Bloodworth's, though the content defied sense. The ledger contained no accounts of grain or livestock, but instead listed names, dozens of them, each paired with a date and a symbol. Some of these names matched the missing persons' records from the past 20 years in 3 counties. Others were marked with a star and the word claimed. The most disturbing entry was the last. October 14th, 1795. The door is open. The offering awaits. We shall not return as we were in the weeks that followed. Rumors deepened. Children claimed to see a thin man with a crooked smile, watching them from the edge of fields at dusk. A traveling peddler reported finding a small cairn of stones along the North Road, topped with one of the same black candles from the manor, still warm to the touch despite the rain, when Reverend Bell was called back to Albany in late spring for further questioning. His health had visibly deteriorated. His hair, white before, had taken on a yellowed, brittle look. His hands trembled as he spoke. You think they ran, he told the magistrate, but you are wrong. They have not left. They are beneath. Pressed to explain, Bell refused, saying only that he could no longer speak of it without inviting them closer. He died in his sleep 3 nights later. His diary, left to a nephew, contained only one passage about the Bloodworths, written in a slanting, feverish scrawl. There is no fire that can unmake them. By summer, the official investigation was quietly shuttered. The legislature saw no value in pursuing a case with no bodies, no suspects, and only hysteria to show. For months of expense, the record of Bloodworth was filed away in the Albany archives, where it gathered dust for decades, though some say certain pages were removed by an unknown hand in the 1820s. Still, the tale refused to die in Ashford Hollow. Parents warned their children not to wander near the ruins. Hunters avoided the northern woods after dark, and on some nights, when the wind carried just right, the faint echo of chanting could be heard from the hill. Though no one dared investigate, one autumn evening, a year to the day after the fire, a candle was found burning on the stone threshold of the ruined manor. It was black, tall, and flawless, not a trace of melting, though the wick was alight. Those who saw it swore the flame burned blue, just as it had in the hall that night. The constable at the time ordered it doused. They used water, then sand, then finally buried it deep in the earth. The next morning, it was back on the threshold, burning as before. After that, they left it alone, and so the Bloodworths became less a matter of law and more a matter of whispered superstition until, of course, the sightings began again. But that is a matter for later and darker chapters. They say time has a way of burying even the darkest of deeds, but in Ashford Hollow, the name Bloodworth was never truly buried. It was merely pressed down beneath the soil, like something still breathing, still waiting. By the early 1800s, the ruins of the Bloodworth Manor were little more than a blackened foundation. Moss crept along the stones. Saplings pushed their way up through what had once been the Grand Hall. But those who ventured too close spoke of an oppressive silence, as if the woods themselves held their breath. In 1809, a group of young men from the nearby village of Brimfield, emboldened by drink, decided to spend the night in the ruins. They returned before dawn, pale and trembling, speaking in half-formed sentences about a figure in the doorway and the sound of chains beneath the earth. One of them, a farmer named Elias Kerr, would later hang himself in his father's barn. His suicide note contained only 3 words: "It calls again. By 1817, the Bloodworth story had found new life, not as a cautionary tale, but as inspiration for a group of spiritualists who called themselves the Congregation of the Returning Dawn. They claimed to be heirs to the Bloodworth legacy, though none could prove any blood relation. Meeting in barns and abandoned mills, they reenacted fragments of the Bloodworth rites, pieced together from rumor and local gossip. Several of their members disappeared in the winter of 1818. The leader, a gaunt man named Charles Harrow Whitby, was later found wandering the banks of the Hudson, barefoot and frostbitten, whispering over and over, "The door was open, but they wouldn't let me through." It was around this time that a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Every 13 years, without fail, there would be a cluster of disappearances within 20 miles of Ashford Hollow. A trapper gone missing in the woods, a child vanishing from a locked bedroom, a preacher who never arrived at the next town on his circuit. There were never bodies, never any signs of struggle, just absence. And the quiet horror it left behind. In 1831, the Hudson Gazette ran a peculiar story about an old ledger found hidden in the wall of a collapsing inn. The entries dated back decades, and once again, the handwriting bore an uncanny resemblance to Jonas Bloodworth's. The final page contained a chilling note: "We are patient. Time is the only offering left to give." Some historians dismissed the ledger as an elaborate forgery, a morbid hoax to sell newspapers, but others saw it as confirmation that the Bloodworth presence had never been extinguished, only waiting, adapting, folding itself into new forms. By mid-century, the Bloodworth name had seeped into folklore so deeply that even those who scoffed at superstition found themselves glancing over their shoulder when walking past the hill at dusk. Travelers reported seeing lantern lights flickering among the trees where no path existed. A schoolteacher swore she saw a man in an antiquated crimson coat watching her from the edge of the yard, though no one else noticed. In 1854, a gravedigger in Albany uncovered something unsettling while expanding the churchyard. 6 coffins buried without markers, each containing only a brass key and a single black candle. The wood was fresh, less than a year in the ground. No record existed of their burial. The church quietly reburied them in a different part of the yard, this time in unblessed ground, and yet the stories persisted. The last documented sighting, if you believe such things can be documented, occurred in the winter of 1882. A railway surveyor named Thomas Lyle claimed to have seen a man and a woman standing on the frozen surface of the Hudson just before dawn. They were facing the riverbank, motionless. As he approached, the ice beneath them did not crack, did not even groan. They simply began to sink slowly, impossibly into the water without breaking the surface. By the time Lyle reached the spot, there was nothing but unbroken ice. To this day, the Bloodworth Hill remains untouched by development. Locals will tell you that surveyors always find some reason to abandon the project: strange soil readings, missing equipment, workers refusing to return after dark. On certain autumn nights, when the wind shifts just right, you might catch the faint smell of smoke in the air, even though no fire burns for miles. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Bloodworth story is not the possibility that the family survived, nor that their influence has endured in secret societies and whispered rites, but that the line between history and legend has grown so thin that you can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. Court records exist, newspaper clippings survive. The ledger is real, you can hold it in your hands if you know the right archivist to bribe. And yet, every tangible piece of evidence seems to carry with it the same strange weight, the same sense that you are not just studying the past, but inviting it back into the present. There are those who believe the Bloodworth family were merely zealots, dangerous, yes, but mortal, and subject to the same decay as any man or woman. And then there are those who point to the unbroken chain of vanishings, the recurring symbols, the identical handwriting across decades, and ask, how long does a family truly live if they have learned to shed their names, their bodies, even their time? Which brings us to the final question, a question I leave not to the magistrates of history, nor the skeptics of the present, but to you. If the Bloodworth family still walks among us, do you believe you would recognize them? Or would you see only a neighbor, a stranger on the train, a quiet figure in the corner of a church, until the day you too vanish without a trace? Perhaps the Reverend was right. Perhaps there is no fire that can unmake them, and if that is true, then somewhere tonight, a black candle is burning in the dark.